The morning of September 15, 1982, dawned crisp and clear in the small town of Millbrook, North Carolina. Pastor William Bill Harrison stood at his kitchen window, watching the golden sunlight filter through the ancient oak trees that surrounded his modest parsonage. At 43, Bill was a man of quiet strength, with graying temples that spoke of wisdom earned through years of shepherding his flock at First Baptist Church of Millbrook. His wife Martha hummed softly as she prepared his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. Their daughter Sarah, just 16, sat at the kitchen table reviewing her notes for a history test, her auburn hair catching the morning light in the same way her mother's had 20 years earlier when Bill first fell in love with Martha at seminary. "Another beautiful day the Lord has made," Bill said, settling into his chair at the small wooden table that had been a wedding gift from Martha's parents. The table bore the gentle scars of family life, ring stains from countless coffee cups, small scratches from homework assignments, and the faint outline where Sarah had once traced her hand in crayon when she was 5. Martha smiled as she placed his plate before him, her gentle touch on his shoulder a familiar comfort. "You seem thoughtful this morning, honey. Everything all right?" Bill nodded, though something indefinable had been weighing on his spirit for weeks. As a pastor, he was accustomed to the spiritual battles that came with ministry, but lately, he'd felt an unusual heaviness, as if God was preparing him for something significant. His morning prayers had been longer, more intense, filled with a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. "Just feeling called to pray more intensely lately," he admitted, taking Martha's hand. "I've been sensing that God is moving in our community, preparing hearts for something. I want to make sure I'm ready for whatever he has planned." Sarah looked up from her textbook, her brown eyes, so much like her father's, reflecting the maturity that often surprised adults who met her. "Dad, Mrs. Thompson mentioned that her husband has been asking questions about faith again. Maybe that's part of what you're sensing." Bill smiled at his daughter's spiritual sensitivity. Sarah had grown up in the church, but unlike many pastors' kids who rebelled against their upbringing, she had embraced her faith with genuine enthusiasm. She led the youth group's prayer team, volunteered at the local food bank, and had already expressed interest in missionary work after college. The Harrison family finished breakfast with their customary prayer. Hands joined around the table as Bill thanked God for his provision and asked for wisdom for the day ahead. It was a ritual they had maintained, for Sarah's entire life, a cornerstone of stability in their simple but deeply meaningful existence. After breakfast, Bill walked the short path from the parsonage to the church, a journey he had made thousands of times over his 15 years of ministry in Millbrook. The church building, constructed in 1923, stood as a testament to the faith of generations past. Its white clapboard siding had been freshly painted the previous spring by volunteers from the congregation, and the bell tower still housed the original bronze bell that had called the faithful to worship for nearly 6 years. Bill's study was located in the back corner of the church, a cozy room lined with theological books, commentaries, and volumes of sermon collections from great preachers of the past. The walls displayed his seminary degree, family photos, and framed verses that had sustained him through the challenges of pastoral ministry. His favorite, hanging directly behind his desk, was from Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." As he settled into his morning routine of prayer and study, Bill felt that familiar stirring in his spirit again. He opened his journal, a leather-bound book where he recorded prayer requests, sermon ideas, and personal reflections, and began to write. September 15, 1982. "Lord, I continue to feel your spirit moving in unusual ways. Yesterday, during my visit to the Miller farm, old Henry mentioned dreams he's been having about his deceased father. He said his father appeared to him in the dream, urging him to make things right with you before it's too late. Even Mrs. Garrison, who hasn't darkened the church door in 5 years, stopped me at the grocery store to ask about forgiveness. I sense you are preparing hearts for revival. Father, use me as you see fit." The morning passed peacefully as Bill worked on his sermon for the upcoming Sunday. His text was from Luke 15, the parable of the lost sheep, and he felt led to focus on God's relentless pursuit of those who had wandered away from the fold. As he wrote, he couldn't shake the feeling that this message was particularly timely, though he couldn't understand why. Around 11 o'clock, the phone rang. It was James Crawford, one of the church deacons and Bill's closest friend in Millbrook. James owned the local hardware store and had been a pillar of the community for over 20 years. "Bill, I'm sorry to bother you during study time," James said, his voice carrying an unusual note of concern, "but I just got a call from Sheriff Davidson. There's been an accident out on Highway 421. The Hendricks family was involved in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. They're asking for you at the hospital." Bill's heart sank. The Hendricks family, Tom, Linda, and their twin 80-year-old boys were faithful members of his congregation. Tom served as the church treasurer, and Linda taught Sunday school for the primary grades. The thought of them injured, possibly critically, sent a wave of anguish through his pastoral heart. "How bad is it, James?" Bill asked, already reaching for his jacket. I don't have all the details, but Sheriff Davidson said it's serious enough that they wanted a pastor there immediately. I can drive you if you'd prefer not to go alone. No, I'll take my car. I may need to stay for a while, and you've got the store to run. Pray for them, James. Pray for wisdom for me to know how to comfort them. Bill quickly gathered his Bible, a small bottle of anointing oil, and a devotional book he often used for hospital visits. He left a note for Martha in case she came looking for him, explaining where he had gone and that he wasn't sure when he would return. The drive to the regional hospital in neighboring Ashford typically took 45 minutes, but Bill made it in 35, his mind racing with prayers for the Hendricks family and for the right words to offer comfort in what was surely their darkest hour. The mountain roads were familiar to him. He had traveled them countless times for hospital visits, funeral preparations, and pastoral care calls throughout the region. As he drove, Bill reflected on the sacred privilege of being called to minister to people in their most vulnerable moments. It was in times of crisis that he felt most acutely the weight of his calling and the absolute necessity of relying on God's strength rather than his own. He had learned over the years that presence was often more important than words, that sometimes the greatest ministry was simply sitting with someone in their pain and pointing them toward the hope that could only be found in Christ. The hospital parking lot was unusually crowded for a Wednesday afternoon, and Bill had to park in the far section reserved for visitors. As he walked toward the emergency entrance, he prayed silently for the Hendricks family, for the medical staff treating them, and for his own heart to be prepared for whatever he might encounter. Inside the hospital, the familiar smells of antiseptic and floor wax brought back memories of countless pastoral visits over the years. He approached the information desk, where a young woman with kind eyes and a tired expression looked up at him with recognition. "Pastor Harrison," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "They're waiting for you in the family conference room. Dr. Martinez wanted to speak with you before you see the family." Bill's heart constricted. A request to speak with the pastor before seeing the family was rarely a good sign. He followed the volunteer down a corridor lined with motivational posters and health education displays, each step feeling heavier than the last. Dr. Martinez was a man Bill had met several times over the years during various medical emergencies involving his conditions. He was known for his competence and his gentle bedside manner, qualities that had earned him the respect of both the medical community and the local clergy. "Pastor Harrison," Dr. Martinez said, extending his hand with a grave expression, "thank you for coming so quickly. I wanted to prepare you for what you're about to encounter." The Hendricks family was involved in a very serious accident. Mr. Hendricks sustained multiple internal injuries and is currently in surgery. The prognosis is uncertain. Bill nodded, his pastoral training helping him remain calm even as his heart broke for his friends and Linda, the boys. "Mrs. Hendricks has a severe concussion and several broken ribs, but she's conscious and asking for you." The children, Dr. Martinez paused, his professional composure slipping slightly. "Pastor, the twins didn't survive the impact. They were killed instantly." The words hit Bill like a physical blow. Tommy and Timmy Hendricks, bright 8-year-old boys who had just started 3rd grade, who collected baseball cards and sang in the children's choir with voices like angels. The image of their gap-toothed grins and their excitement during last week's Sunday school lesson about David and Goliath flashed through his mind. "Linda doesn't know yet," Dr. Martinez continued quietly. "We were waiting for you to arrive before telling her. We thought it might be better coming from someone she trusts, someone who can offer spiritual comfort alongside the terrible news." Bill closed his eyes for a moment, seeking strength from the one who had called him to this ministry. This was why pastors existed, not just for the joyful moments of baptisms and weddings, but for the devastating times when people needed to know that God's love persisted even in the darkest valleys. "Where is she?" Bill asked, his voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. "Room 247. She's been asking for you repeatedly." "Pastor, I have to warn you, she's going to need extensive emotional and spiritual support in the coming days and weeks. Losing children while her husband fights for his life. It's more than most people can bear." Bill made his way to Lynn's room, stopping outside the door to pray once more for wisdom, for the right words, for God's presence to be tangible in that hospital room. He had delivered difficult news before, but never quite this devastating to a family so close to his heart. Linda Hendricks lay in the hospital bed, her face bruised and bandaged, her eyes searching desperately for hope. When Bill entered the room, the moment she saw him, she began to cry. "Pastor Bill," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the accident and the medications. "Tom, is Tom going to be okay? And my babies? Where are my babies? No one will tell me about Tommy and Timmy." Bill pulled a chair close to her bedside and took her uninjured hand in both of his. For a moment, he simply sat with her in silence, allowing his presence to communicate what words could not. Then, with a gentleness born of years of pastoral experience and a breaking heart, he began to speak. "Linda, honey, Tom is in surgery right now. The doctors are doing everything they can for him. He's fighting hard, and we're going to pray for God's healing touch on his body." Linda's eyes searched his face, looking for the information he hadn't yet provided. "And the boys? Pastor Bill, where are Tommy and Timmy? Why won't anyone let me see them?" Bill felt the weight of every theology class he had ever taken, every book he had read about suffering and evil, every sermon he had preached about God's goodness in the face of tragedy. But in this moment, all of that faded away, leaving only a pastor's heart breaking for his friend and the impossible task of delivering news that would shatter her world. "Linda," he said softly, his thumb gently rubbing the back of her hand. "Tommy and Timmy. They went home to be with Jesus in the accident. They didn't suffer, sweetheart. They went instantly from this life into the arms of their Savior." The sound that escaped from Linda Hendricks was unlike anything Bill had ever heard, a keening wail that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking, the cry of someone whose world had just collapsed entirely. For the next hour, Bill sat with Linda as she grieved, offering what comfort he could through scripture, prayer, and simple presence. He held her hand as she sobbed, whispered words of hope about heaven and the promise of eternal reunion, and assured her repeatedly that God had not abandoned her family even in this darkest moment. As evening approached, other members of the congregation began arriving at the hospital. James Crawford came with his wife Susan, followed by several other deacons and their spouses. The hospital waiting room filled with people from First Baptist Church, all of them seeking ways to support the Hendricks family and to process their own grief over the loss of two beloved children. Bill moved between Linda's room and the waiting area, ministering to his congregation even as he struggled with his own questions about why such tragedy had befallen such a faithful family. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Tom Hendricks was moved from surgery to the intensive care unit, still unconscious but stable. "He's going to have a long recovery," Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled group. "Multiple surgeries, months of rehabilitation. But he's alive, and that's more than we dared hope for this afternoon." Bill spent the night at the hospital, alternating between praying with Linda, checking on Tom's condition, and comforting the church members who had maintained their vigil throughout the evening. It was during one of his quiet moments in the hospital chapel that he felt that stirring in his spirit again stronger than ever, as if God was preparing him for something even more significant than this tragedy. As dawn broke on September 16th, Bill finally drove home to shower and change clothes before returning to the hospital. Martha met him at the door, having spent the night in prayer after receiving word about the accident from James Crawford. "How are they?" she asked, embracing her husband as he walked through the door. "Linda is devastated. As you can imagine, Tom is stable but critical. The boys," Bill's voice broke for the first time since receiving the news. "Martha, those precious boys are gone. 8 years old, full of life and love for Jesus, and now they're gone." Martha held her husband as he wept for the first time since the previous afternoon. It was a necessary release, the kind of grief that only another pastor's spouse could truly understand. She had walked this journey with him for 15 years, sharing the burden of caring for a congregation through their highest highs and lowest lows. "God is still sovereign," Martha whispered, not as a platitude but as a declaration of faith in the face of inexplicable tragedy. "We don't understand his ways, but we trust his heart." Bill nodded against his wife's shoulder, drawing strength from her faith and from the reminder that he served a God who was intimately acquainted with grief, who had watched his own son suffer and die. It was this truth that would sustain him in the difficult days ahead, and it was this truth he would need to help his congregation understand as they struggled to make sense of such profound loss. After a quick breakfast and a shower, Bill prepared to return to the hospital, but as he gathered his Bible and notes for the day, Martha stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "Bill, I want you to know something. Last night, while I was praying for the Hendricks family, I felt the Lord impressing something on my heart. This tragedy is going to be used for His glory somehow. I don't know how or when, but I felt such a strong conviction that God is going to bring something beautiful out of this terrible situation." Bill looked into his wife's eyes, seeing the quiet confidence that had attracted him to her all those years ago. Martha had always been sensitive to the Lord's leading, and her spiritual insights had guided him through many difficult decisions during their ministry together. "I believe you," he said, kissing her forehead. "I've been sensing God moving in unusual ways lately. Maybe this is part of whatever He's preparing our community for." As Bill drove back to the hospital that morning, he had no way of knowing that his wife's prophetic words would prove more significant than either of them could imagine. The tragedy that had befallen the Hendricks family was indeed going to be used for God's glory, but in ways that would test Bill's faith to its very limits and ultimately lead to his own disappearance from Millbrook. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital visits, funeral planning, and pastoral care for a grieving congregation. The double funeral for Tommy and Timmy Hendricks was held on Saturday, September 18th, with the church building overflowing with mourners from throughout the region. Bill preached a message about the hope of resurrection and the promise that death had no final victory for those who belong to Christ. "We gathered today not to say goodbye to Tommy and Timmy," Bill declared from the pulpit, his voice strong, despite his breaking heart, but to celebrate their graduation to glory. They have simply moved from the church visible to the church triumphant, from our loving arms to the loving arms of Jesus. The service was a powerful testimony to the faith that sustained the Millbrook community, even in their darkest hour. People who hadn't been in church for years attended the funeral, drawn by the tragedy but also by the hope that Bill proclaimed in the midst of sorrow. After the service, as the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall for a meal prepared by the women of the church, Bill noticed several visitors he didn't recognize. One man in particular caught his attention, a well-dressed stranger in his 50s who stood quietly in the back of the room, observing the interactions but not participating in the conversations. "James," Bill said to his friend, nodding toward the stranger. "Do you know who that man is?" "I don't recall seeing him before." James followed Bill's gaze and shrugged. "No idea. Could be someone from Linda's family, or maybe a friend of Tom's." From work, tragedy has a way of bringing people out of the woodwork. Bill made a mental note to introduce himself to the stranger before he left. But as the afternoon wore on and he became absorbed in conversations with grieving church members, he lost track of the mysterious visitor. By the time he looked for him again, the man had disappeared. The weeks following the Hendricks tragedy settled into a rhythm of hospital visits, grief counseling, and slowly returning to the normal routines of pastoral ministry. Tom Hendricks remained in intensive care, but was gradually improving, while Linda had been discharged to recover at home with the support of her extended family and the church community. Bill threw himself into his pastoral duties with renewed intensity, visiting the hospital daily, preparing sermons that addressed the questions of suffering and faith that inevitably arose after such a tragedy, and providing individual counseling to church members who were struggling to understand why God would allow such devastating loss. It was during this period that Bill began receiving anonymous notes. The first one appeared on his desk on a Tuesday morning in early October, written in block letters on plain white paper. "Pastor Harrison, you don't know the whole truth about the accident. Some secrets are better left buried. A friend." Bill studied the note carefully, trying to determine what it might mean. The accident had been thoroughly investigated by the sheriff's department, and the case seemed straightforward. A drunk driver had crossed the center line and hit the Hendricks family head-on. The driver, a man from out of state with multiple DUI convictions, had died on impact. Bill showed the note to Martha that evening, and they agreed it was probably the work of someone with mental health issues who had been affected by the tragedy. Such incidents were not uncommon in small communities after traumatic events, but more notes followed. The second one arrived the following week, slipped under the door of the church office. "The drunk driver wasn't alone. Ask about the passenger who disappeared before the police arrived. Ask about the money." This note was more specific and troubling. Bill contacted Sheriff Davidson to inquire about the details of the investigation, but the sheriff assured him that everything had been thoroughly examined and that there were no unanswered questions about the accident. "Pastor Harrison," Sheriff Davidson said during their phone conversation, "I understand you're trying to make sense of this tragedy, but sometimes there just isn't a deeper meaning to explore. A drunk driver killed 2 innocent children and critically injured their parents. It's a terrible thing, but it's unfortunately not complicated." Despite the sheriff's reassurances, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. The notes continued to arrive sporadically, each one containing cryptic references to hidden information about the accident. By the end of October, Bill had received 6 anonymous notes, and they were beginning to affect his sleep and his ability to concentrate on his pastoral duties. The final note arrived on November 1st, All Saints' Day, tucked into his Bible when he opened it to prepare for the evening service. "Pastor, meet me at the old Millbrook Cemetery tomorrow night at 11 p.m. Come alone if you want to know the truth about what really happened to the Hendricks family. This is your last chance." Bill stared at the note for a long time, weighing his options. His rational mind told him this was likely a prank or the work of someone with psychological problems. But his pastoral heart, trained to seek truth and justice, couldn't ignore the possibility that there might be information that could bring closure to the Hendricks family or prevent future tragedies. He decided not to tell Martha about this particular note, knowing she would try to dissuade him from meeting with an anonymous correspondent in a remote location. Instead, he spent the evening in prayer, asking God for wisdom and protection. November 2, 1982, dawned gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that promised an early winter. Bill went through his normal routine morning prayers, breakfast with his family, study time in his office, but his mind kept returning to the mysterious meeting scheduled for that evening. During lunch, he received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a man who identified himself as Robert Caldwell, claiming to be a private investigator from Asheville, who had been looking into the circumstances surrounding the Hendricks accident. "Pastor Harrison," Caldwell said, his voice urgent but professional, "I've been investigating irregularities in the official report of the accident that killed the Hendricks children. I have reason to believe that the accident wasn't as straightforward as the authorities reported, and I think you may be in danger because of your position in the community. What kind of irregularities? Bill asked, his pulse quickening. I'd rather not discuss details over the phone. Could we meet somewhere private? I have documentation that I think you need to see, especially before you take any actions, based on information you might have received from other sources. The timing of the call, so close to the mysterious meeting scheduled for that evening, seemed too coincidental to ignore. Bill agreed to meet with Caldwell at a diner outside of town at 6 o'clock that evening. Pastor, Caldwell added before ending the call, please don't tell anyone about our meeting. And please don't go anywhere alone tonight until we've had a chance to talk. I'm concerned about your safety. Bill spent the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation, trying to focus on his pastoral duties while his mind raced with questions about what Caldwell might reveal. He canceled his evening visitation plans and told Martha he needed to attend a meeting with someone from out of town who was considering a ministry position in the area. The diner where he met Robert Caldwell was a modest establishment that catered primarily to truck drivers and travelers passing through the area. Caldwell was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of observant eyes that suggested years of investigative work. He carried a briefcase and wore a serious expression that immediately put Bill on alert. Pastor Harrison, Caldwell said as they settled into a corner booth, thank you for meeting with me on such short notice. I know this must seem unusual, but I have information about the Hendricks accident that I believe you need to know. Caldwell opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder containing photographs, police reports, and what appeared to be witness statements. I was hired by an insurance company to investigate discrepancies in the claims related to the accident. During my investigation, I discovered several troubling inconsistencies in the official report. He spread the documents across the table, pointing to specific details as he explained his findings. First, the official report states that the drunk driver was alone in his vehicle. But I have a witness who saw a passenger exit the vehicle and flee the scene before emergency responders arrived. Second, there was a significant amount of cash found in the drunk driver's vehicle, nearly $10,000, that was never mentioned in any of the official reports. Bill studied the documents, his mind struggling to process the implications. Are you suggesting that the accident was intentional? That someone paid this man to kill the Hendricks family? I'm suggesting that there are questions that need to be answered, Caldwell replied carefully. Questions that certain people in your community might not want investigated too thoroughly. Caldwell pulled out a photograph of the accident scene, pointing to details that had been overlooked in the official investigation. This skid mark pattern suggests the drunk driver's vehicle accelerated just before impact, rather than attempting to brake or swerve. And this damage to the rear bumper of his car indicates he was pushed or struck by another vehicle immediately before the collision. The revelation hit Bill like a physical blow. If Caldwell was correct, then the deaths of Tommy and Timmy Hendricks weren't a random tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated murder. But who would want to harm such a beloved family, and why? There's more, Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I have reason to believe that Tom Hendricks had discovered something possibly financial, irregularities or illegal activities that certain people wanted to keep quiet. The accident may have been intended to silence him permanently, but Tom survived. Bill pointed out, yes, and that may be why you've been receiving those anonymous notes. Someone wants to make sure that whatever Tom discovered stays buried, and they may see you as a threat because of your close relationship with the family. Caldwell reached into his briefcase again and pulled out copies of the anonymous notes Bill had been receiving. I know about these because I've been monitoring the situation. Pastor, I believe you're being set up. That meeting tonight at the cemetery, it's a trap. Bill's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone about the cemetery meeting, which meant that either Caldwell was involved in whatever conspiracy existed, or the situation was even more dangerous than he had imagined. How do you know about the meeting? Bill asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the car keys in his pocket. Because I've been watching the people who have been watching you, Caldwell replied. Pastor, there are powerful people in this area who are involved in activities that would shock you. Tom Hendricks stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen, and now they're trying to clean up loose ends. Caldwell glanced around the diner nervously before continuing. I've been investigating corruption in this part of North Carolina for 3 years. What started as an insurance fraud case has uncovered a network of illegal activities involving local officials, business leaders, and even some church leaders from various denominations. Are you saying someone in my church is involved? I'm saying that not everyone who appears to be serving God is actually serving his purposes. Pastor, I have evidence that suggests the anonymous notes you've been receiving are designed to lure you into a situation where you can be eliminated as a potential threat. Bill felt the room spinning around him. The idea that people he trusted, people he had served alongside in ministry, could be involved in murdering children was almost too horrific to comprehend. What do you want me to do? Bill asked, finally. Caldwell reached across the table and placed a small device in Bill's hand. This is a recording device. If you're determined to go to that meeting tonight, and I strongly advise against it, then at least wear this so there will be a record of what happens. But Pastor, my recommendation is that you take your family and leave town immediately. Go somewhere safe while I complete my investigation. I can't abandon my congregation, Bill replied instinctively. These people depend on me. If there's corruption in our community, then it's my responsibility as a pastor to help expose it and protect the innocent. Caldwell studied Bill's face for a long moment, then nodded with what appeared to be respect. I was hoping you would say that. Pastor, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what you're facing. He pulled out another folder, this one containing financial records and bank statements. Tom Hendricks discovered that someone has been embezzling money from multiple churches in this area over the past 5 years. The scheme involves inflated construction costs, fake charity organizations, and kickbacks from local contractors. The total amount stolen is nearly $500,000. $500,000. Bill gasped. The sum was staggering, especially considering the modest budgets of most rural churches. The money has been funneled through a network of accounts and shell companies. But Tom Hendricks had figured out the pattern. He was an accountant before he became church treasurer, and he recognized the signs of systematic fraud when he saw them. Caldwell pointed to specific entries in the financial records. 3 days before the accident, Tom had scheduled a meeting with the state attorney general's office to report his findings. The accident happened on his way to that meeting. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Tom Hendricks had discovered corruption involving local churches, had planned to report it to authorities, and had been killed to prevent that report from being made. But the attempt to silence him had failed because he had survived, which meant the conspirators were now desperate to prevent anyone else from learning what he had discovered. Pastor Caldwell said urgently, I need you to understand that these people have already demonstrated they're willing to kill children to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill you if they perceive you as a threat. Bill sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what he had learned. The innocent faith that had sustained him through 15 years of ministry felt shattered by the revelation that people he trusted might be capable of such evil. What evidence do you have that proves these allegations? Bill asked finally. Caldwell opened his briefcase one more time and withdrew a thick manila envelope. Copies of bank records, witness statements, photographs of documents, and recorded conversations. Everything you need to understand the scope of the conspiracy and to take it to federal authorities if necessary. He pushed the envelope across the table to Bill. Pastor, I'm giving this to you because I believe you're one of the few people in this community who can be trusted with this information. But I'm also warning you that possessing this evidence puts you in mortal danger. Bill took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of its contents both literally and figuratively. What happens now? Now you have a choice, Caldwell replied. You can take this evidence to the FBI field office in Charlotte and let federal authorities handle the investigation. Or you can try to confront the corruption within your own community. But Pastor, if you choose the second option, you need to be prepared for the consequences. As they prepared to leave the diner, Caldwell placed a hand on Bill's shoulder. Pastor Harrison, I've seen a lot of corruption in my career, but I've rarely met someone with your integrity and courage. Whatever you decide to do, know that you have my support and my prayers. Bill drove home through the darkening November evening, his mind reeling from the revelations of the past hour. The envelope sat on the passenger seat beside him like a ticking bomb, containing information that could destroy the faith and trust of his entire community while potentially saving them from further victimization. When he arrived home, Martha was waiting for him with dinner and a concerned expression. How was your meeting, honey? You look troubled. Bill looked at his wife, the woman who had stood beside him through every challenge of their ministry together, who had supported him through countless difficult decisions, and realized that he was about to face the most difficult choice of his pastoral career. How could he tell her that people they had trusted, people they had served alongside in ministry, might be murderers and thieves? How could he explain that their quiet, faithful community was built on a foundation of lies and corruption? Martha, he said carefully, I need to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to hear. But first, I need you to promise me that you'll trust me no matter how strange this might sound. As Bill began to explain the evening's revelations to his wife, neither of them could have imagined that by morning, he would be gone as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Millbrook for the next 40 years. 40 years had passed since Pastor William Harrison disappeared without a trace on the night of November 2, 1982. The mystery of his vanishing had become part of Millbrook's folklore, a story told and retold by generations of residents who had their own theories about what had happened to the beloved pastor. Sarah Harrison Mitchell, now 56 years old and a successful attorney in Charlotte, had never stopped searching for answers about her father's disappearance. She had been just 16 when he vanished, a junior in high school who was forced to grow up overnight as her mother Martha struggled to cope with the devastating loss of her husband and the collapse of their secure world. The years that followed had been difficult ones for the Harrison family. Martha had eventually remarried a kind man named Robert Coleman, who had shown patience and understanding as she grieved her first husband, but she had never fully recovered from the trauma of Bill's disappearance. She had passed away in 2019, taking with her any hope that she might someday learn what had happened to the man she had loved so deeply. Sarah lived in a comfortable home in Charlotte's Myers Park neighborhood, where she had built a successful career in corporate law while raising 2 children of her own. But despite her professional achievements and personal happiness, the question of her father's fate had never stopped haunting her. She had hired private investigators, filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and even consulted psychics in her desperate search for answers. On the morning of November 2, 2020, exactly 40 years after her father's disappearance, Sarah was preparing for another day at the law firm when her housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, brought her the morning mail. Mrs. Mitchell, the elderly woman, said in her soft Spanish accent, "There's something unusual in today's mail. A letter with no return address, postmarked from Millbrook." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She rarely received mail from her hometown anymore, and the timing on the 40th anniversary of her father's disappearance seemed too coincidental to ignore. She thanked Mrs. Rodriguez and took the mail to her study, her hands trembling as she examined the envelope. The letter was addressed to her in careful handwriting that looked familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. The postmark showed it had been mailed 3 days earlier from Millbrook, North Carolina. There was no return address, but something about the envelope felt weighty, important, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. Sarah sat down at her mahogany desk, the same desk where she had written countless legal briefs over the years, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in the same careful handwriting as the address. As she unfolded it, a small key fell onto the desk with a metallic clink. Her breath caught in her throat as she began to read. Dear Sarah, if you are reading this letter, then I am dead, and the time has finally come for you to learn the truth about what happened to your father 40 years ago. My name is Robert Caldwell, and I was the private investigator who met with your father on November 2, 1982, the night he disappeared. For 4 decades, I have carried the burden of knowing what happened to Pastor William Harrison, but I was sworn to secrecy by your father himself. He made me promise that I would only reveal the truth if it became clear that his sacrifice had been in vain, or if 40 years passed without the corruption he died to expose being brought to justice. That time has come. Your father did not abandon his family, Sarah. He did not run away from his responsibilities or lose his faith. He made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the people he loved and to ensure that a terrible evil would not continue to harm innocent families in Millbrook. The key that fell from this envelope will open a safety deposit box at First National Bank of Millbrook, box number 1847. Inside that box, you will find evidence that will shock you, devastate you, and ultimately free you from 40 years of questions. You will learn that your father was a hero who chose to disappear rather than allow murderers to claim more victims. But I must warn you, Sarah, the truth comes with a price. Once you open that box and read what your father left for you, you will carry the same burden I have carried for 40 years. You will know things about people in your community that will change how you see the world forever. The choice is yours. You can burn this letter, throw away the key, and continue living with the questions that have haunted you since you were 16. Or you can drive to Millbrook, open that box, and finally learn why your father chose to disappear on that November night in 1982. If you choose to seek the truth, be careful who you trust. The corruption your father died to expose has deep roots in Millbrook, and some of those roots may still be alive. I pray that God will give you wisdom to know what to do with the information you find. With my deepest regrets and my highest respect for your father's memory, Robert Caldwellps. Tell no one about this letter until you have read everything in the safety deposit box. Your father's life and, possibly your own, may depend on your discretion. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking more violently with each reading. After 40 years of wondering, questioning, and imagining the worst possible scenarios, she was being offered the answers she had desperately sought. But the warning about the price of truth made her hesitate. She picked up the small brass key, turning it over in her palm as she tried to process what she had just learned. Her father hadn't abandoned them, he hadn't suffered a mental breakdown or run away with another woman or any of the other terrible possibilities that had tormented her teenage years. He had been involved in something dangerous, something that had ultimately cost him his life, but had been done to protect others. The revelation brought a mixture of relief and fresh grief. Relief that her father had remained the good man she remembered, but grief for the sacrifice he had made and the 40 years of questions that could have been avoided if she had known the truth sooner. Sarah spent the morning staring at the letter and the key, unable to focus on the legal documents that required her attention. Finally, around noon, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She called her assistant and canceled all her appointments for the rest of the week. "I have a family emergency," she told Jennifer, her longtime assistant, who had become almost like a daughter to her. "I need to drive to North Carolina for a few days. Please reschedule my client meetings and tell the partners I'll be back on Monday." The drive from Charlotte to Millbrook took just over 2 hours, giving Sarah plenty of time to remember her childhood in the small mountain town. She hadn't been back since her mother's funeral 3 years earlier, and returning now under these circumstances brought back a flood of memories, both beautiful and painful. As she drove through the winding mountain roads, Sarah thought about her father's faith, and how it had shaped her own understanding of right and wrong throughout her legal career. Pastor William Harrison had been a man of uncompromising integrity, someone who believed that truth and justice were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. If he had chosen to disappear rather than expose corruption in another way, he must have had compelling reasons that she couldn't yet understand. Millbrook looked much the same as it had during her childhood, though some of the businesses had changed and new subdivisions had been built on what used to be farmland. The town square still centered around the old courthouse, and many of the same families still lived in the same houses where they had resided 40 years earlier. First National Bank of Millbrook occupied the same brick building where Sarah had opened her first savings account as a 10-year-old, encouraged by her father to learn the value of saving money and managing finances responsibly. The familiarity of the place made her mission feel surreal. She was about to uncover family secrets in a location where she had once deposited birthday money and Christmas gifts. The bank manager, a woman in her 50s named Carol Patterson, remembered Sarah from her childhood and expressed sympathy about the loss of her mother. Sarah explained that she needed to access a safety deposit box that had been left to her by a family friend, presenting the key and the required identification. Box 1847, Carol said as she led Sarah to the vault area. This box was opened originally in 1982, and the rental fees have been paid annually by automatic bank draft ever since. The account was set up to continue payments for 50 years, or until the box was accessed by someone with this specific key. The safety deposit box was larger than Sarah had expected, approximately the size of a shoebox, but deeper. Carol used her bank key in combination with Sarah's key to open the box, then left Sarah alone in a private room to examine the contents. Inside the box, Sarah found a collection of items that painted a picture of conspiracy and murder that was almost too shocking to believe. There were financial records showing systematic embezzlement from churches throughout the region, photographs of meetings between trusted community leaders and known criminals, and most damning of all, a detailed confession written in her father's handwriting. The confession was dated November 2, 1982, the night her father disappeared. As Sarah read his words, written in the careful script she remembered from birthday cards and homework help, she began to understand the terrible choice he had been forced to make. My dearest Sarah and Martha, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I have been forced to implement the only plan that might keep you safe while ensuring that the truth about Tom Hendricks' murder eventually comes to light. By now, you have learned from Robert Caldwell about the corruption that Tom discovered in our church community. What you haven't learned yet is that the corruption goes much deeper than stolen money. It involves murder, and the people responsible have made it clear that they will kill anyone who threatens to expose them. Tonight, I am supposed to meet with the person who has been sending me anonymous notes about the Hendricks accident. Caldwell has convinced me that this meeting is a trap designed to eliminate me as a potential threat, but I have decided to attend the meeting anyway, not to walk into their trap, but to turn the tables on them. I have spent the past week preparing for this night. I have moved money from our accounts to a trust fund that will provide for you. And Sarah, I have documented everything I know about the corruption and the murder of the Hendricks children, and I have arranged with Caldwell to disappear in a way that will make it impossible for these people to harm my family, while still preserving the evidence they are trying to destroy. Sarah, my precious daughter, I know this will be difficult for you to understand. You are only 16, and you deserve to have your father walk you down the aisle at your wedding and hold his grandchildren in his arms. But these people have demonstrated that they will kill children to protect their secrets, and I cannot allow them to hurt you or your mother. The evidence in this box will prove that the Hendricks accident was actually murder, orchestrated by people we trusted and served alongside in ministry. Tom Hendricks had discovered that James Crawford, Elder Thompson, and Sheriff Davidson were embezzling money from churches throughout the region and using that money to fund illegal gambling operations and loan sharking businesses. When Tom scheduled a meeting with state authorities to report what he had discovered, these men arranged for him to be killed. They hired a man named Billy Watsuna, career criminal with gambling debts, to stage a drunk driving accident that would eliminate Tom and his family. Watson was supposed to die in the accident, but he survived long enough to confess to a nurse at the hospital. That nurse, Patricia Donovan, was murdered 3 days later in what was made to look like a robbery. I learned about Patricia's murder from Caldwell, and I realized that these men would stop at nothing to protect their secret. When I received the anonymous notes, I understood that I was next on their list. But rather than running away or going to authorities who might be compromised, I chose a different path. Tonight, I will attend the meeting at the cemetery as planned. But instead of walking into their trap, I will use the meeting to gather final evidence of their guilt. Caldwell has provided me with recording equipment, and I hope to obtain confessions that can be used to bring them to justice. After the meeting, I will disappear using an identity and resources that Caldwell has prepared for me. I know this means I will never see you or your mother again in this life. I know it means you will grow up believing that your father abandoned you. But I pray that someday, when you are old enough to understand and when it is safe to reveal the truth, you will forgive me for choosing to protect you rather than staying to fight a battle that might have gotten us all killed. The trust fund I have established will provide for your education and your mother's needs. The money came from legitimate sources, savings we had accumulated over the years, and a small inheritance from my father that I had never told Martha about. It is clean money earned through honest work, and I pray it will help you build a good life even without me there to guide you. Sarah, I want you to know that disappearing is the hardest thing I have ever done. You are the light of my life, and leaving you breaks my heart in ways I cannot describe. But I would rather live the rest of my life in exile, knowing that you are safe, than stay and risk having these men hurt you to get to me. If you are reading this decades from now, it means that the corruption I died to expose has never been brought to justice. It means that James Crawford, Elder Thompson, and Sheriff Davidson or their successors have continued to operate their criminal enterprise while maintaining their respectable facades in the community. You have a choice to make, my daughter. You can use this evidence to finally bring them to justice, or you can protect yourself by keeping the truth buried forever. I will not judge you for whatever choice you make. You have already suffered enough because of my decision to fight this evil. But if you do choose to seek justice, remember that you are not alone. God sees everything, even what is hidden in darkness. Truth has a way of coming to light, even when it takes 40 years. And somewhere, your father is praying for you and believing that you have the strength and wisdom to do what is right. I love you more than words can express. I am proud of the woman you will become, and I pray that someday, in the new heaven and new earth, we will be reunited in a place where evil cannot touch us and families are never torn apart by the greed and corruption of wicked men. Your father, always and forever, William Harrison *. Sarah finished reading the confession with tears streaming down her face. For 40 years, she had wondered if her father had stopped loving them, if he had suffered some kind of breakdown, if he had chosen to leave them for reasons she would never understand. Now she knew that every day of his absence had been a sacrifice he made to protect them, a choice that had cost him everything he held dear. But along with the emotional revelation came a burning anger at the men who had forced her father to make such a terrible choice. James Crawford, Elder Thompson, and Sheriff Davidson, names she remembered from her childhood. Men who had attended her father's church, who had shaken his hand and called him friend while plotting to murder him. Sarah wiped her tears and continued examining the contents of the safety deposit box. There were financial records showing the extent of the embezzlement scheme, photographs of secret meetings, and most shocking of all, a recording device that her father had used to capture confessions on the night he disappeared. With trembling hands, Sarah picked up the small tape recorder and pressed play. Her father's voice, sounding exactly as she remembered it, filled the small room. November 2, 1982. 10:45 p.m. I am about to enter Millbrook Cemetery to meet with the person who has been sending me anonymous notes. If something happens to me tonight, I want there to be a record of what I discovered and why I felt compelled to take this action. Tom Hendricks was murdered because he discovered systematic theft from churches throughout our region. The theft was orchestrated by James Crawford, who used his position as church deacon and business owner to gain access to financial records and embezzle funds. Sheriff Davidson provided protection from law enforcement scrutiny, while Elder Thompson used his connections with other churches to expand the operation. When Tom scheduled a meeting with state authorities to report the theft, these men arranged for him to be killed in what would appear to be a drunk driving accident. They hired Billy Watson, a man with gambling debts, to Crawford's illegal operation. To stage the accident, Watson was told that he would be injured but would survive. But the men intended for him to die in the crash to eliminate him as a witness. Watson survived long enough to confess to Nurse Patricia Donovan, who was murdered 3 days later when she began asking questions about Watson's claims. Her murder was staged to look like a robbery, but I have evidence that Sheriff Davidson was involved in her death. I am recording this because I believe these men intend to kill me tonight, but I also believe that God's justice will ultimately prevail, even if it takes years or decades. The evidence I have compiled will eventually bring them to account for their crimes. The recording continued with her father describing his plans for the evening, and his hope that he would be able to gather additional evidence of the conspiracy. But then Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of footsteps approaching, followed by a voice she recognized even after 40 years. "Pastor Harrison," said the voice of James Crawford, "thank you for coming. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your future in Millbrook." Sarah sat in stunned silence as the 40-year-old recording continued to play. Her father's voice remained calm and steady, even though he knew he was walking into mortal danger. "James, I'm here because I believe you have information about the Hendricks accident that the community needs to know. Too many questions have been left unanswered, and I owe it to Tom and Linda to seek the truth." Crawford's laugh was cold and calculating. "The truth, Pastor. The truth is that Tom Hendricks was a fool who couldn't mind his own business. And the truth is that you're about to make the same mistake he did." "Are you confessing to murder, James?" her father asked, his pastoral training evident in his calm, non-accusatory tone. "I'm stating a fact," Crawford replied. "Tom Hendricks discovered our business operations and threatened to destroy everything we had built. We couldn't allow that to happen. Too many people depended on the income we generated. Too many families would have been hurt if our operations had been shut down." Sarah paused the recording, her hands shaking with rage and grief. James Crawford had just confessed to murdering the Hendricks children, and he had spoken about it as if it were a business decision. The casual way he discussed the death of 8-year-old twins made her physically ill. She forced herself to continue listening, knowing that her father had risked everything to obtain this evidence. "James, you're talking about children. Tommy and Timmy Hendricks were innocent 8-year-old boys. How can you justify their deaths for money?" "I justify it by thinking about my own children, my own family," Crawford replied without apparent remorse. "Tom Hendricks would have destroyed everything we worked for. His death was necessary to protect our livelihood and the livelihoods of everyone else involved in our operations." "Who else is involved?" her father asked. "People you trust, Pastor. People you've served alongside for years. Sheriff Davidson has been protecting our operations from law enforcement scrutiny. Elder Thompson has been helping us expand into other churches throughout the region. Even some of the other pastors know about our activities and receive a share of the profits." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her as she realized the scope of the corruption her father had uncovered. This wasn't just about 3 men stealing money, it was about a network of respected community leaders who had built their prosperity on theft and murder. The recording continued with Crawford explaining how the embezzlement scheme worked and how they had eliminated threats to their operation. But then Sarah heard her father ask the question that would seal his fate. "James, what happens now? Are you planning to kill me the way you killed Tom and Patricia Donovan?" Pastor Crawford said with mock sadness. "You've already sealed your fate by coming here tonight. You could have minded your own business, focused on your preaching and your family, and lived a long, happy life. But you chose to play detective, just like Tom Hendricks did. And just like Tom Hendricks, you're going to have an unfortunate accident." "An accident?" her father asked. "A tragic fall in the cemetery. Pastor, slipped on wet leaves while visiting a grave, hit your head on a tombstone. Very sad, very believable. Your body will be found in the morning by the groundskeeper, and the whole community will mourn the loss of their beloved pastor." Sarah heard the sound of a struggle on the recording, followed by her father's voice calling out for help. But then she heard something that confused her: the sound of car engines starting and vehicles driving away rapidly. The struggle seemed to stop abruptly, and she could hear her father breathing heavily, but apparently unharmed. "Thank God," her father whispered into the recording device. "Caldwell's plan worked. They think I'm dead, but I managed to escape." Into the woods, when they were distracted by the police sirens, he arranged to have broadcast from a radio in his car. Sarah realized what had happened. Robert Caldwell had orchestrated a deception that allowed her father to escape while convincing Crawford and his accomplices that their plan had succeeded. But that meant her father might still be alive, have spent the past 40 years in hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The recording continued with her father explaining Caldwell's plan. "Caldwell anticipated that they would try to kill me tonight, so he prepared an escape route through the woods behind the cemetery. When Crawford attacked me, I fought back long enough for Caldwell to activate the diversion he had planned. The men fled when they heard what they thought were police sirens approaching, giving me time to escape into the forest. I am now at a safe location that Caldwell prepared for me. Tomorrow, I will assume a new identity and begin a new life in a place where Crawford and his accomplices cannot find me. It breaks my heart to leave Martha and Sarah, but it's the only way to ensure their safety while preserving the evidence that will eventually bring these murderers to justice. Sarah, if you are listening to this recording, it means that 40 years have passed and I am no longer alive to protect this evidence myself. I pray that you will have the courage to use what I have given you to finally bring justice for the Hendricks family and for all the other victims of this criminal enterprise." The recording ended with her father's voice breaking as he said goodbye to his family one final time. Sarah sat in the bank's private room, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had learned. Her father had spent the last 40 years of his life in exile, separated from everyone he loved, to protect them and to preserve evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted. But now she faced the same choice her father had confronted 40 years earlier. She could take this evidence to authorities and finally bring justice for the Hendricks family. Or she could protect herself and her own family by keeping the truth buried forever. Sarah gathered all the materials from the safety deposit box and placed them carefully in her briefcase. She thanked Carol Patterson for her assistance and walked out of the bank into the late afternoon sunlight of Millbrook's town square. As she stood on the sidewalk where she had played as a child, Sarah noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the street. It was an elderly man in his 80s, walking slowly but with purpose toward where she stood. As he got closer, she recognized him as Dr. Matthews, the man who had been the town's only physician during her childhood. "Sarah Harrison," Dr. Matthews said as he reached her, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she remembered from childhood checkups. "I thought I might find you here today." "Dr. Matthews," Sarah replied, surprised by his presence. Did you know I was in town?" "Because I've been waiting for 40 years for someone to claim that safety deposit box," he said quietly. "I was the one who helped Robert Caldwell set up the arrangements to keep it maintained until you were ready to learn the truth." Sarah's eyes widened. "You knew about my father's plan." "I knew enough," Dr. Matthews replied. "I was the doctor who treated Billy Watson before he died, and I was there when he confessed to Nurse Donovan about the real reason for the Hendricks accident. When Patricia was murdered 3 days later, I realized that everyone connected to Watson's confession was in danger." "Did you know my father was still alive?" Dr. Matthews nodded sadly. "For a while, yes. Caldwell arranged for me to receive periodic updates about your father's health and well-being during his first few years in exile. But those communications stopped about 10 years ago. I believe your father passed away around 2012, though I was never able to confirm the exact circumstances." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent the afternoon hoping that her father might still be alive somewhere, that there might be a chance for reconciliation after 40 years of separation. But Dr. Matthews' words confirmed that she was truly an orphan now, that both her parents had died without her ever learning the full truth about their sacrifices. "Dr. Matthews," Sarah said through her tears, "what should I do with this evidence? My father preserved it for 40 years, but most of the people involved are probably dead by now." "Not all of them," Dr. Matthews replied grimly. "James Crawford died in 1995, and Sheriff Davidson passed away in 2003, but Elder Thompson is still alive, still living in the same house where he lived 40 years ago. He's 92 years old now, but he's still sharp mentally. And there are others, children and grandchildren of the original conspirators who inherited businesses built with stolen money." Dr. Matthews placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Your father wanted justice for the Hendricks family, but he also wanted the truth to come out in a way that would prevent future victims. The criminal enterprise he exposed didn't die with the original conspirators, evolved and continued under new leadership." "Are you saying the corruption is still ongoing?" "I'm saying that the same families who profited from theft and murder 40 years ago are still profiting from it today. They've just gotten better at hiding their activities and eliminating threats. Before they become dangerous." Sarah felt a surge of determination rise within her. Her father had given up everything to preserve evidence of these crimes, and she owed it to his memory and to the memory of Tommy and Timmy Hendricks to see that justice was finally served. "Dr. Matthews," she said firmly, "I need your help. I want to expose everything my father discovered, but I want to do it in a way that ensures the guilty parties are actually prosecuted. What do you recommend?" "I recommend that you take this evidence to the FBI field office in Charlotte," Dr. Matthews replied. "Federal authorities are less likely to be compromised by local connections, and they have the resources to investigate a conspiracy that spans multiple decades and involves multiple jurisdictions. Will you come with me? Will you testify about what you know?" Dr. Matthews nodded without hesitation. "Sarah, I've been waiting 40 years for the chance to testify about what I witnessed in that hospital room when Billy Watson confessed to murdering the Hendricks children. I'm 86 years old, and I won't live much longer. Before I die, I want to see justice done for those innocent boys and for your father, who sacrificed everything to preserve the truth." 2 days later, Sarah Harrison Mitchell and Dr. Matthews sat in a conference room at the FBI field office in Charlotte, presenting evidence of a 40-year-old conspiracy to Special Agent Karen Rodriguez and a team of federal investigators. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, recorded confessions, witness statements, and physical proof of systematic corruption that had claimed multiple lives and stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from churches throughout western North Carolina. "Ms. Mitchell," Agent Rodriguez said after reviewing the materials, "this is one of the most comprehensive cases of documented corruption I've ever seen. Your father was remarkably thorough in his investigation, and the evidence he preserved is still admissible in court despite its age." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now we begin the process of bringing justice for your father and for all the victims of this criminal enterprise," Agent Rodriguez replied. We'll start by arresting Elder Thompson and anyone else who is still alive and can be connected to the original conspiracy. Then we'll investigate the financial records to determine who may have inherited assets that were obtained through criminal activities. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and shocking. Federal agents discovered that the corruption Pastor William Harrison had exposed in 1982 had continued for 4 decades, evolving into a sophisticated network of financial crimes that had affected dozens of churches and hundreds of families throughout the region. Elder Thompson, now 92 years old but still mentally competent, was arrested at his home in Millbrook and charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and accessory to murder. During his interrogation, he confessed to his role in the Hendricks murders and implicated several other individuals who had continued the criminal enterprise after the deaths of Crawford and Davidson. The arrests made national news, particularly because of the 40-year gap between the crimes and their prosecution. Pastor William Harrison's story became a symbol of sacrifice and perseverance, inspiring countless people who had faced their own battles against corruption and injustice. 6 months after Sarah opened her father's safety deposit box, she stood before a packed courtroom in Charlotte as Elder Thompson was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. The judge, noting the extraordinary circumstances of the case, paid special tribute to Pastor Harrison's sacrifice. William Harrison could have chosen to protect himself and his family by remaining silent about the corruption he discovered. Judge Patricia Morrison said, instead, he chose to preserve evidence of these crimes at the cost of his own freedom and happiness. His actions demonstrate the highest form of moral courage, and his sacrifice has finally brought justice for the innocent victims of this criminal enterprise. After the sentencing, Sarah visited the Millbrook Cemetery where her father had gathered the evidence that ultimately brought down his killers. She placed flowers on the graves of Tommy and Timmy Hendricks, finally able to tell them that the men who had murdered them had been brought to justice. As she stood in the quiet cemetery, Sarah felt a presence that seemed both familiar and comforting. It was as if her father was there with her, finally at peace, knowing that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The truth he had preserved for 40 years had finally come to light, bringing justice for the innocent and ensuring that his family's suffering had not been meaningless. That evening, Sarah returned to Charlotte with a sense of closure she had never thought possible. She had learned that her father was a hero, not an abandoner. She had discovered that his love for his family had been so great that he had willingly given up everything to protect them, and she had fulfilled his dying wish by ensuring that the truth he preserved would finally bring justice for all the victims of the corruption he had died to expose. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah opened her father's Bible, one of the items that had been preserved in the safety deposit box, and found a note he had written on the inside cover. Sarah, if you are reading this, then God's justice has finally prevailed. Remember that evil may triumph for a season, but truth and righteousness will ultimately overcome every lie and every act of corruption. I love you more than words can express, and I am proud of the woman you have become. Your father, always and forever, William Harrison. Through her tears, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude for a father who had loved her enough to sacrifice everything, and for a God who had preserved the truth through 40 years of darkness until justice could finally be served. The mystery that had haunted her family for 4 decades was finally solved, and the healing could finally begin. In the months that followed, Sarah established the William Harrison Foundation for Church Financial Accountability, using the recovered, stolen funds to help churches implement better oversight and protection against financial fraud. The foundation became a lasting tribute to her father's memory and ensured that his sacrifice would continue to protect innocent people for generations to come. The letter that had arrived 40 years to the day after her father's disappearance had indeed revealed a shocking truth that changed an entire community. But more than that, it had proven that love, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice could triumph over even the most deeply entrenched corruption and evil. Pastor William Harrison had kept his promise to protect his family and preserve the truth, and after 40 years in exile from everything he held dear, he had finally come home.